The most popular drink in the world started a war. Not over land, not over religion, over a cup of tea. By the 1800s, the British Empire was drinking so much Chinese tea it was hemorrhaging silver, and China wanted nothing they had to offer in return. So the most powerful empire on earth found another way to pay. It got an entire nation hooked on drugs, on purpose, as a business plan. And when China tried to stop it, the empire sent its warships. What followed would humiliate the oldest civilization on the planet, hand over a city that would matter for the next 150 years, and it all began with something sitting in a teacup. The most popular drink in the world once started a war. Not over land, not over God, over a cup of tea. Picture London at the end of the 1700s. Fog on the river, coal smoke in the air, and inside every home, from the poorest lodging to the grandest estate, the same ritual. Water on the boil, leaves in the pot, the clink of porcelain. By this point, the British had fallen completely, hopelessly in love with one drink. And that drink came from exactly one place on Earth: China. It's hard to overstate how deep this went. Tea wasn't a luxury anymore. It was the fuel of an empire. Factory workers drank it, duchesses drank it, sailors drank it, the government taxed it and lived off the money. An entire nation had rearranged its daily life around leaves grown thousands of miles away in a country it barely understood and could not control. And here's where the trouble began. Because China didn't need Britain. Not the wool, not the clocks, not the clever machines the British were so proud of. When European merchants arrived with their finest goods, the Chinese court gave one of the coldest answers in the history of trade. The Celestial Empire possesses all things in abundance and has no use for your manufactures. Translation: we don't want your stuff, but we'll take your money. And the money they wanted was silver. Hard, cold silver. That was the only thing China would accept in exchange for its tea, its silk, its porcelain. So that's what Britain paid. Ton after ton after ton of it, sailing east and never coming back. Now think about what that actually meant. Every cup of tea in London was a small drain, and millions of cups a day added up to a flood. Silver was pouring out of British hands and into Chinese vaults, and none of it returned. For a while, the empire could stomach it. Tea was worth it. But behind the closed doors of banks and trading houses, a quiet panic was beginning to spread. This wasn't a shortage of a nice drink. This was a strategic wound. In that century, silver was power. It paid armies, it backed currencies, it held empires together. And the most powerful empire on the planet was slowly bleeding it out, one teacup at a time, into a country that looked down on it and refused to buy a single thing in return. The men who ran Britain were not the kind to accept that quietly. They looked at the problem the way a gambler looks at a losing table. They needed something, anything, that the Chinese people would want so badly they'd hand the silver back. Something China couldn't make itself. Something people would pay for again and again and again, no matter the cost. They found it. And what they chose was so dark, so deliberately cruel, that it would poison millions of human beings, humiliate the oldest civilization on Earth, and hand over a city that would still matter more than a century and a half later. Here's the part almost no one tells you. The drug at the center of this war, the one the whole world remembers, was never really the beginning. The true addiction, the one that set everything in motion, was already sitting in every British home. White cups, warm steam, perfectly innocent. Nobody suspected that this quiet little ritual was about to trigger one of the greatest crimes an empire ever committed. If stories the history books skip over are what you're here for, subscribe now, because this one is only getting started. The empire had found its way to make China pay, and it was monstrous. The monstrous solution had a name: opium. It grew in the fields of India, in Bengal, land the British already controlled through the East India Company, the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen. This wasn't some back-alley criminal operation. This was a company with its own armies, its own navy, its own laws. And it looked at the poppy fields of India and saw the answer to everything. The plan was almost elegant in its cruelty. The company would grow opium in India, ship it to China, sell it to the Chinese people for silver, then take that same silver and buy the tea that Britain was desperate for. A perfect loop, a machine that turned human misery into a national beverage. They called it the triangle. India grew the drug, China consumed it, Britain drank its tea. And around it went, silver and poppy and tea leaves, each corner feeding the next. There was just one small problem. Opium was illegal in China. The emperors had banned it decades earlier. They knew exactly what the drug did to a person, how it hollowed them out, stole their work, their family, their will to live. The Chinese government wanted nothing to do with it, so the British broke the law, on purpose, as policy. Here's how they did it, and it's genuinely clever in the way only something truly ruthless can be. The East India Company never technically sold opium in China. That would have been too dirty, too traceable. Instead, they auctioned the drug off the coast of India to independent traders. Country merchants, they were called. These men loaded the chests onto fast ships, sailed to the Chinese coast, and handed the opium to smugglers who slipped it inland through a web of bribed officials and hidden coves. That way, the company kept its hands clean. On paper, it wasn't a drug dealer. It was just a respectable business that happened to grow enormous quantities of a narcotic and sell it to men whose only job was to break another country's laws. The distance was the whole trick. Everyone got rich, and no one had to admit what they were doing. And business was booming. At first, the numbers were modest, a few thousand chests a year slipping into southern China. But the drug did what drugs do. It spread. One user became 10, 10 became 100. The chests multiplied, 2,000, 5,000, then tens of thousands, each one packed with enough opium to ruin dozens of lives. The coastline filled with smuggling ships. Whole networks of corruption grew up to move the product inland, and every link in that chain took its cut. But here's the part that turns this from a business story into a human catastrophe. Every one of those chests ended somewhere, in a room, in a hand, in a body. Because you can talk about triangles and silver and clever accounting all day, but opium isn't a spreadsheet. It's a substance that reaches into the human brain and refuses to let go. And it had just been aimed, deliberately, at one of the largest populations on Earth. The men in London saw growth charts and rising profits. What was actually happening was something else entirely. In the port cities of China, then the towns, then villages far inland, people were lighting the pipe for the first time. A soldier here, a clerk there, a father, a son, a shopkeeper, each one certain they could stop whenever they wanted. None of them could. The empire had built its machine. The triangle was spinning. The silver was finally flowing back toward British hands, exactly as planned. On every ledger in London, it looked like a triumph. But a poison this large doesn't stay quiet forever. Soon the counting houses would fall silent, and the panic would move from Britain to a far greater seat of power. Because very soon, millions of people across China would find that they simply could not stop. It started with the body. Opium doesn't announce itself. The first pipe feels like warmth spreading through the chest, a heaviness behind the eyes, the world going soft at the edges. Pain disappears. Worry disappears. For a few hours, a man forgets he is poor or tired, or afraid. And then it wears off, and the only thing in the world that can bring that feeling back is another pipe. Multiply that by one person, then by 1,000, then by millions. That's what was happening across China now. The drug that London had aimed at the coast had crept inland like water finding cracks in stone. It moved through the port cities first, then up the rivers, then into towns and villages that had never seen a foreign face. Dock workers smoked it to get through the day. Soldiers smoked it in the barracks. Officials smoked it behind closed doors. And once it had you, it did not let go. The scenes that spread through the country were like something out of a nightmare. Dens filled with men lying on wooden platforms, pipes glowing in the dark, bodies wasting away while the smoke curled toward the ceiling. Men who had once worked, provided, mattered, now selling everything they owned for the next dose. Then their wives' belongings. Then their children's food. Some sold the children themselves. Estimates from the time are staggering. Millions of Chinese had become addicts. Some say 4 million, some far more. Entire regions were losing their workforce to the pipe. Farmers stopped farming. Soldiers stopped soldiering. An army whose men were hooked on opium is not an army at all, and China's generals knew it. And now the money moved the other way. For decades, silver had flowed into China, the price the world paid for tea and silk. That had been the natural order of things, the thing that made China feel untouchable. But the drug reversed it. To feed the addiction, silver now poured out of China and into the hands of the traders. The most self-sufficient empire on earth was watching its own wealth drain away, not stolen by an army, but carried out voluntarily, coin by coin, by its own addicted people. This is what makes the whole scheme so devastating. Britain hadn't just found a product to sell. It had found a way to make an entire nation fund its own destruction and pay Britain for the privilege. Now the panic that had once haunted London moved to a far greater seat of power, the Forbidden City itself. Behind those red walls, the Emperor's court finally understood the scale of what was happening. This wasn't a crime problem. It wasn't even an economic problem anymore. It was an existential one. The drug was rotting the country from the inside. Its soldiers, its officials, its treasury, its people, all dissolving into smoke. And here the story sharpens, because the court did not agree on what to do. Some ministers argued for surrender to reality, legalize the drug, tax it, at least keep the silver at home. If people were going to smoke, let China profit instead of Britain. It was a cold, practical argument, and it had powerful supporters. But others were horrified. Legalize the poison that was destroying the nation? Bow to the foreign smugglers who had broken China's laws for profit? To them, that wasn't policy, it was betrayal. The debate reached the emperor himself, and he made his choice. There would be no surrender, no legalization. The opium would be stopped, crushed completely, no matter the cost, no matter who it angered across the sea. To do it, he needed a man who could not be bribed, could not be frightened, and would not fail. A man willing to challenge the most powerful empire on earth to its face. He found exactly that man, and what this official was about to do would light the fuse on a war. His name was Lin Zexu, and he was exactly the wrong man for the British to underestimate. He was a scholar official, brilliant, incorruptible, famous across China for refusing bribes that would have made lesser men rich for life. When the emperor needed someone to destroy the opium trade, there was no one better. Lin was given the title of Imperial Commissioner and near total power in the south, where the drug came ashore. In 1839, he arrived in Guangzhou, Canton, as the foreigners called it, the beating heart of the smuggling trade, and he moved fast. Lin didn't waste time chasing individual dealers. He went straight for the source. He surrounded the foreign warehouses, the factories where the traders lived and worked, and cut them off. No food shipments in a normal way, no servants, no escape, until they handed over every chest of opium they held. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria herself, appealing to her conscience. How could a nation that banned opium at home grow rich by pushing it on someone else's people? The letter, as far as we know, never reached her. The traders held out. Lin held firmer. And in the end, they broke. They surrendered the opium, an enormous haul, more than 1,000 tons of the drug, over 20,000 chests, the largest seizure of narcotics the world had ever seen. Then came the moment that would echo across history. Lin didn't burn it. Burning opium leaves a residue people can scrape and smoke. Instead, he had enormous trenches dug near the sea. Workers broke the chests open and dumped the raw opium in, mixing it with water, salt and lime until it dissolved into sludge. Then they flushed the whole ruined mass out into the ocean. It took weeks. Hundreds of laborers worked under guard, and Lin reportedly wrote a prayer of apology to the sea gods for the poison he was about to pour into their waters. Think about the scale of it. A fortune in narcotics, worth millions upon millions, deliberately turned to poison sludge and washed away. It was one of the boldest acts of defiance any nation had ever thrown at the British Empire. A clear, unmistakable message. China would not be a market for this, not anymore. Lin believed he had won. The drug was destroyed, the traders were humiliated, the law had been enforced. From where he stood, justice had finally been done. He had no idea what he had just triggered. Because in London, the story was told completely differently. The traders who lost their opium were not criminals in British eyes. They were British subjects, and their property had been seized by a foreign power. It didn't matter that the property was an illegal drug. It didn't matter that they had broken China's laws for years. What mattered was that a fortune had been destroyed, and someone had to answer for it. The opium merchants had powerful friends in Parliament. They lobbied hard. They framed the destruction not as China defending itself, but as an insult to British honour, an attack on free trade, a theft that demanded revenge. The debate in Parliament was fierce. Some members were disgusted at the idea of going to war to protect drug dealers. One famous voice called it a war so unjust it would cover the country in permanent shame. But shame doesn't move fleets. Money and pride do. The vote was close, dangerously close, but it passed. Britain would send its warships to China, not to apologize for the drug, to demand payment for it. Lin Zexu had stood up to the most powerful empire on earth and won a single, brilliant victory. What he didn't know was that the empire had already decided to answer him with cannons, and that the fleet now being assembled would carry technology his forces had never even imagined. The war began, and it was not a war. It was a slaughter dressed up as one. On one side stood China, a vast empire with a proud military tradition, but an army built for a different age. Its coastal defences relied on old cannons bolted into stone forts, junks with sails, soldiers armed with matchlock guns, swords, and spears. For centuries, this had been enough. China had never faced an enemy that could reach it from the far side of the world. On the other side came the British fleet, and at its centre was a machine the Chinese had no answer for. Its name was the Nemesis. She was something the world had barely seen before, an iron-hulled steamship driven by paddle wheels instead of wind. She didn't care which way the breeze blew. She could push up rivers against the current into the shallow waters where Chinese junks thought they were safe. She carried heavy guns and Congreve rockets that screened through the air and set everything they touched on fire. The Nemesis was the future of war, and she had sailed halfway around the planet to introduce herself to the past. What followed was brutally one-sided. British warships pounded the coastal forts from beyond the range of Chinese guns. When junks came out to fight, the Nemesis and her sisters tore them apart, sinking whole fleets in a matter of hours. Steam-powered ships towed sailing warships into position, delivering firepower exactly where it was needed, whenever it was needed. The Chinese defenders fought bravely. There are accounts of soldiers standing their ground and dying almost to the last man rather than fleeing. But courage cannot stop a shell it cannot reach. The British pushed north along the coast, taking city after city. They seized Jushan. They battered the forts guarding Guangzhou. Then they drove up the Yangtze River, the great artery of China, with their steamships cutting inland where no foreign fleet had ever gone. When they reached the city of Zhenjiang, the fighting was savage, and when it fell, they were poised to strangle the empire's lifeline. The grain and trade that fed the capital moved along that river. Cut it, and China would starve. The emperor's court, which had been so defiant, now faced a horrifying truth. Their forces couldn't win. They couldn't even slow the enemy down. Every battle ended the same way. Chinese dead in the hundreds, British losses often in the single digits. This was not a contest of two armies. It was one civilization demonstrating, in blood, that another was 100 years behind. And here's the cruel irony at the heart of it all. Remember what this war was actually about. Not territory, not religion, not even a real dispute over honor. It was about protecting the right to sell a drug, to force open a market for opium that a sovereign nation had every right to refuse. The most advanced military technology on Earth had been dispatched across the world to make sure the poison kept flowing. China had no choice left but to surrender. In 1842, aboard a British warship anchored in the Yangtze, Chinese officials signed the Treaty of Nanjing, and it was a document designed to humiliate. China had to pay a massive indemnity, including compensation for the very opium Lin Zexu had destroyed. It had to open its ports to British trade on British terms. It had to accept that British subjects on Chinese soil would answer only to British law, not Chinese courts. Every clause was a wound. But one clause cut deeper than the rest, and it would still be bleeding a century and a half later. Because in that treaty, China handed over a small, rocky, half-empty island off its southern coast. Barely anyone lived there. It seemed like almost nothing, a footnote next to the money and the ports. That island was called Hong Kong, and giving it away would turn out to be one of the most consequential losses in the history of the modern world. You would think that would be the end of it. A defeated empire, a signed treaty, a fortune paid. Surely the appetite had been satisfied. It hadn't, not even close. Because the treaty that humiliated China didn't actually solve the problem the British cared about. The ports were open, yes, Hong Kong was theirs, but opium itself was still, technically, illegal in China. And the British wanted more. More ports, more access, deeper into the country. And above all, they wanted the drug trade made fully legal, so it would never again depend on smugglers and bribes and the goodwill of officials like Lin Zexu. China, wounded but not broken, resisted. And so, less than 2 decades after the First War, the West found another excuse for a second. The pretext was almost absurd. Chinese officials boarded a ship suspected of piracy and smuggling, a ship registered, questionably, under a British flag. Britain treated it as an insult to the flag itself. France, looking for its own foothold, joined in over the killing of a French missionary. 2 of the most powerful nations on earth had decided, again, that the way to open China was to break it. The Second Opium War was even more devastating than the first. The Allied forces pushed inland with the same crushing technological advantage as before. They stormed the forts guarding the approach to the capital, and this time they didn't stop at the coast or the rivers. This time they marched on Beijing itself, the seat of the emperor, the center of a civilization that had considered itself the middle of the world. The emperor fled. And then came an act so vindictive it still stains the record. Outside Beijing stood the old summer palace, Yuanmingyuan, a breathtaking complex of gardens, lakes, and halls that had taken generations to build. It held centuries of art, treasure, and history, the accumulated beauty of an entire dynasty. British and French troops looted it first, stripping it of everything they could carry. Then, on the orders of the British command, they burned it to the ground. It took days. The smoke hung over the capital like a shroud. When it was over, one of the greatest cultural treasures in human history was gone, deliberately, as punishment, as a message. The message was received. China signed again. More ports opened. Foreign diplomats got permanent residence in Beijing. Christians won the right to spread their faith across the country. And this time, finally, opium was legalized. The drug that had started it all was now, officially, a legal import. The crime had won. This is the moment historians point to as the true beginning of what the Chinese would come to call the century of humiliation. Wave after wave of foreign powers, not just Britain, but France, Russia, Germany, Japan, the United States, would carve concessions out of China, seize ports, impose their own laws on Chinese soil, and treat the ancient empire as something to be divided up and consumed. The self-sufficient civilization that had once made the world pay in silver was now being picked apart by the very nations that had once begged at its gates. All of it flowing, ultimately, from a poppy and a cup of tea. The scale of what was lost is hard to hold in the mind. Not just wealth, not just land, something deeper, the sense of a great nation that it controlled its own destiny. That was the real theft, and it left a wound in the Chinese memory so deep that it still shapes how the country sees the world today, more than a century and a half later. But remember that small rocky island handed over almost as an afterthought. That footnote in the first treaty, Hong Kong. That single piece of the deal wasn't finished doing its work. In fact, its strangest and most far-reaching chapter was still to come, one that would stretch all the way into a year that people alive today can remember, and end in a scene watched by the entire world. That rocky little island nobody wanted turned into one of the most valuable places on the planet. Hong Kong should have been forgotten. When Britain took it, it was a scattering of fishing villages on barren hills, dismissed by one British official as a barren rock with hardly a house upon it. But, sitting on the edge of China, with a deep natural harbour, it became something else entirely, a gateway. Trade poured through it. British law and capital built a city out of the rock. Banks rose, docks stretched along the water. Refugees fleeing chaos on the mainland flooded in. Over a century, a fishing outpost became one of the great financial capitals of the world. A skyline of glass and steel, where East and West did business under a British flag. But here's the detail that would decide everything. Hong Kong Island itself had been handed over forever, outright. So had a piece of the mainland across the harbour. But the largest part of the colony, the new territories, the land that made the whole place actually work, hadn't been given away at all. It had only been leased, rented. For 99 years, signed in 1898. At the time, 99 years must have felt like forever. A number so large it may as well have been permanent. But clocks don't stop. And as the 20th century wore on, the British began to face an uncomfortable arithmetic. The lease would expire in 1997, and without the new territories, the rest of Hong Kong couldn't survive on its own. No room, no water, no future. When the clock ran out, Britain would have to give it all back. By then, the China across the border was not the wounded empire of the Opium Wars. It had endured revolution, invasion, civil war, and famine, and had risen again as a nuclear power with a long, unforgiving memory. And it remembered exactly how Hong Kong had been taken. As loot, in a war fought to force a drug on its people. To China, this was never just real estate. It was the last open wound of the whole humiliation, and it was going to be closed. So the two sides sat down and negotiated the handover. And on the night of June the 30th, 1997, the world watched a ceremony that felt like the closing of a book opened 150 years earlier. In pouring rain, under the eyes of cameras beaming the moment across the planet, the British flag came down over Hong Kong for the last time. The Chinese flag went up. The last British governor sailed away on the royal yacht, and a place that had been born from the opium trade returned, at last, to the country it had been torn from. Think about the full arc of it. A cup of tea in London, a poppy grown in India, a drug pushed on millions until an empire cracked, a war fought to protect that drug, a treaty, an island, a century of loss, and finally, in the glare of the modern world's cameras, the last piece handed back. Every step of it traceable, if you know where to look, to that one impossible problem. How does a nation pay for something it craves but cannot afford? The answer, it turned out, was a crime so vast it reshaped the map. And that's the thing about the ordinary objects that fill our lives, the tea in the cup, the sugar in the bowl. They look innocent. They look like comfort. But follow them far enough back, and you find blood and greed and whole nations bent to the will of others. History hides its worst crimes inside its most harmless things, and this was only one of them. If this story pulled you in, you need to see where this goes next, because tea is just the beginning. The same dark machine ran on sugar, on cotton, on coffee, on the everyday things sitting in your kitchen right now. Subscribe and follow along, because every single one of them hides a crime just like this, and I'm going to show you all of them, one by one.